Who really owned the Wild West? Most of us picture the familiar scenes: a lone cowboy, a six-shooter, dusty duels under a scorching sun. A simple world where the strongest survived. But that story is only half of the truth. The West wasn't an empty canvas. It was a tapestry woven from countless threads of different stories, different cultures, and different dreams. There was Ilara, a young Lakota woman whose eyes saw the land her ancestors had walked for generations. She saw the river as a life source, the hills as sacred ground. For her, the West wasn't to be conquered, but to be lived with. Then there was Chen, a man who traveled halfway across the world from a small village in China, carrying the hope of a new life. He toiled relentlessly, laying every single tie and stone for the railroad, what many believed would be the lifeblood of a new civilization. For Chen, the West was a promise, a fresh start. There was also Caleb, a former black slave who found a new kind of freedom on horseback as a cowboy. He herded cattle, facing the discrimination of wealthier white ranchers. For Caleb, the West was a fight to prove that freedom wasn't just a word, but a right to be lived. And finally, there were men like Frank, a prospector who saw only gold, only silver. For Frank, the West wasn't a land of stories, but a vast resource waiting to be exploited. This is their story. A story of a Wild West rarely seen on screen, where dreams, cultures, and survival collide. So, who really owned the Wild West? The answer might not be as simple as you think. The West, a land of colliding hopes. For Ilara, that collision came to the very place she held sacred. Chen's trains began to run, their loud whistles tearing through the silence, their cold steel tracks slicing across her tribe's hunting grounds. A new fear crept in, not just of the noise, but of the permanent change it brought. With every train, Ilara felt a piece of the land's soul being stripped away. Further south, Caleb faced barriers far more difficult than any physical fence. He and his herd were turned away from a town controlled by Frank and his kind. "We don't buy from your sort," a white man told Caleb, his eyes full of contempt. Caleb's anger simmered. He was no longer a slave, yet his freedom was still defined by the color of his skin. His rage was afire, and he began to seek out other black cowboys treated similarly, hoping that together they could stand against it. In the mining town, Frank had no time for stories. He only cared about numbers. And the numbers were dropping. As the surface mines dried up, Frank had his crew begin pumping chemicals into the river, the main water source for Ilara's tribe. He knew it was wrong, but to him, it was a necessary evil to keep the profits flowing. When Ilara stood on the riverbank, seeing the oily sheen on the water, she felt a profound sense of betrayal. She confronted Frank, but was met with a cold stare. "This is progress," Frank said. "You'd better get used to it." Ilara felt alone. She was torn between two paths, continuing to protect her ancestors' traditions or accepting that the land was no longer hers. Caleb was no better off. He grappled with whether true freedom even existed on this land, or if he had simply traded one set of chains for another. Chen, who had placed all his hope on this work, began to wonder if he was truly building a better future or just destroying what was already there. Then the storm hit. It didn't discriminate based on wealth, race, or color. It was a primal force of nature. Winds howled, rain poured, and the very ground shook. A massive landslide buried a section of Chen's railroad track. The river overflowed, washing out a bridge and flooding Frank's town. And Caleb's cattle were scattered, lost across a dangerous range of hills. In the chaos, They were all caught in their own personal storm. Frank, trapped in the wreckage with a broken leg, the pain a grim reminder that he did not own nature. Chen, isolated, hearing the groans of the tunnel he was building, realizing how fragile his creation was. Caleb desperately searched for his cattle, knowing that losing them would mean losing his hard-won freedom. And Alara, she saw it all. She saw the destruction the storm caused, and she saw the very people who had encroached on her land now struggling to survive. A difficult choice landed on her shoulders. Would she turn her back on those who had taken so much from her, or would she extend a helping hand and prove that survival on this land wasn't a competition, but a shared journey? Ilara stood there, in the pouring rain, her heart a battlefield. On one side were the memories of what her tribe had lost. On the other, the lives of these men hanging in the balance. The pains of the past clashed with the choice of the present. She made her decision. She ran toward Caleb, who was desperately calling for his cattle in the downpour. "This way," she shouted, pointing to a hidden trail. Caleb hesitated, but Ilara's determined eyes won him over. He followed, and miraculously, they found the herd huddled safely under a rock ledge. Caleb looked at Ilara, his initial suspicion replaced with profound gratitude. Continuing her path, Ilara reached Chin. He was clinging desperately to a cliff face, with a sheer drop and the ruined tracks below. She didn't say a word, just pointed to an alternate path around the hill, where solid rock would allow him to safely repair the track. The look in Chen's eyes shifted from fear to awe as he realized her knowledge of the land had just saved his life. Finally, Ilara came upon Frank, who was shivering with pain and cold. He stared at her in disbelief, unable to fathom that the woman he had dismissed was now his only hope. Ilara didn't speak. She simply helped him bandage his wound and guided him to a dry cave. In the silence of the cave, Frank saw not an enemy, but a person who had chosen compassion over vengeance. For the first time, he saw the land not as an exploiter, but as a human being. The storm passed, leaving a changed world. Frank returned to his town, but no longer as the ruthless prospector. He began to repair the damage he had done to the river. Caleb and Ilara were no longer strangers. They met by chance at a watering hole, sharing stories and finding they had more in common than they had ever realized. Chen, having completed the track repairs, saw the hills not just as an obstacle, but as part of his new home. And Ilara, she stood on her hill, looking down. She saw Chen's train pass, but this time it wasn't a scar. She saw Caleb guiding his herd across the plains, and she saw Frank planting trees by the river. They were still people from different worlds, but they had all learned a vital lesson, that survival on this land wasn't about ownership, but about interdependence. The Wild West was not an empty land to be owned, but a place shaped by the stories of all who fought to survive on it. And in that survival, there were no absolute owners. Only fellow travelers on the same shared, difficult road. And that is the true story of the Wild West.